Some mornings feel like they carry a promise. Soft, unsaid, but undeniable. The morning Lena Brooks and her father boarded Flight 2275 from Atlanta to San Francisco was just such a morning. The air outside Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport shimmered with summer humidity. And yet for Lena, everything felt light, like the world itself had made space for a new chapter. 12 years old and endlessly curious, Lena gripped her paperback novel tightly as she stepped through the automatic glass doors of the terminal. Her backpack was snug on her shoulders, a red ribbon tied around one of the zippers. Her mother's old habit, one Lena had kept. Her eyes scanned the terminal with wonder, drawn to the blinking flight monitors, the slow-moving luggage belts, and the rush of people in all directions. But through it all, her hand remained firmly clasped in her father's. Special Agent Daniel Brooks walked with quiet assurance, his presence commanding not because of his badge, which remained hidden, but because of the calm gravity that followed him wherever he went. Clad in a tailored dark navy suit despite the thick Georgia heat, he moved with the precision of someone used to navigating chaos without making a sound. His gaze, always attentive, swept across the terminal. Never intrusive, just deeply aware. He wasn't here on business today. This was a personal trip long overdue. For the first time in nearly 2 years, they were flying to San Francisco to visit Lena's grandmother, Edith Brooks, a retired civil rights attorney known across the West Coast for her fire in the courtroom and her famous peach cobbler in the kitchen. Lena had missed her fiercely. The cobbler was a bonus. "I still can't believe you got the middle seat," Lena said, glancing up at her father with a teasing smirk. Daniel gave a small smile. "Buffer zone. I take the turbulence so you don't have to." She rolled her eyes but leaned into him slightly. "You're way too overqualified for being a seat buffer, you know." "Don't let the Bureau find out," he replied, feigning a hush. "They might reassign me to window seat protection detail." Lena laughed, the kind of light, innocent sound that momentarily softened the edge of the busy terminal around them. As they reached the security checkpoint, Daniel placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "You remember what we talked about, right?" She nodded solemnly. "Keep my book in my hand, keep my shoes ready, and keep my cool." "Exactly." He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. After clearing security, they made their way toward the gate. Daniel stopped briefly to grab 2 bottles of water, one plain, one lemon-flavored, just as Lena liked it. He didn't ask. He always remembered. At gate A17, the waiting area buzzed with passengers and soft announcements over the intercom. Daniel took a seat near the large windows overlooking the runway, while Lena perched next to him, her nose buried in her book. They looked like any other father and daughter preparing for a trip, but the truth was, they had both carried more than luggage into that terminal. Lena was still learning how to live with the grief of her mother's passing 3 years ago, and Daniel had long ago mastered the art of carrying pain with a straight spine and a quiet resolve. Across the gate, an elegant woman in a cream linen pantsuit tapped her long, manicured nails against the edge of her iPhone. Veronica Aldridge. Her name wasn't yet known to Lena or Daniel, but her presence had already begun to ripple around her like a subtle shift in temperature. Veronica exuded the kind of entitlement that seemed bred rather than earned. Her jewelry understated but expensive, her scowl practiced and sharp. She eyed the crowd around her with thinly veiled disdain. Every announcement was met with a sigh, every child's laugh with a narrowed glare. Her seat, first class of course, had not been what she expected. Something about an aisle instead of a window. Her voice, though not raised, carried a sharpness that made the gate agent's smile falter. Daniel heard it, registered it, but said nothing. Not yet. When boarding was called, he stood and adjusted Lena's backpack. "Let's go." They handed over their boarding passes, exchanged polite smiles with the gate staff, and entered the jet bridge. The air inside the aircraft was cool, a sharp contrast to the humidity outside. Their seats were in the main cabin, row 14. Daniel had requested it specifically. Middle seat for him, window for Lena. The aisle? Unoccupied for now. Lena slid into her seat, placed her bag under the seat in front of her, and opened her book again. Daniel sat beside her, elbows drawn in, careful not to take up too much space. Around them, passengers shuffled past, flight attendants directed with efficiency, and that murmur of cabin life began to take shape. Everything felt normal for a moment. And then Veronica boarded. Her heels clicked against the plane's flooring with quiet authority. She moved slowly, like someone who expected others to adjust to her pace. When she paused briefly near the front of the cabin, there was a whispered exchange with a flight attendant, Maya Green, who smiled professionally and pointed toward her seat. 4C aisle. Veronica frowned. I was assured I'd have a window, she said, her voice clipped. I understand, ma'am, Maya replied, calm and firm. But 4C is what's on your boarding pass. The cabin is fully booked. The conversation ended there, but the tension did not. As Veronica made her way down the aisle, her gaze scanned the rows of passengers. When her eyes landed on Lena by the window, a flicker of something unreadable passed across her face. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. But for now, he said nothing. He reached over, tapped Lena's water bottle closer to her elbow and said softly, You good? She nodded, still reading. Outside the window, the sunlight glinted off the tarmac. Inside, something else was brewing. Subtle but certain. Flight 2275 had not yet left the ground, but already the air felt heavier. Something was coming, and Daniel Brooks, though seated as a father, was beginning to feel the shift as an agent. The final boarding call echoed faintly through the aircraft as the last wave of passengers trickled in. Daniel Brooks, ever watchful, took a casual glance at his watch and then at his daughter, who was now fully engrossed in her book, its worn spine a testament to how often she'd reread it. Lena's lips moved faintly as she mouthed the words under her breath, a small quirk that reminded Daniel of her mother. For a moment, there was peace, until the sharp staccato of high heels broke it once more. Veronica Aldridge had returned. She was no longer in her assigned first-class seat. Instead, she stood near row 14, arms folded, surveying the cabin as though she owned it. Her expression, cool and rehearsed, didn't show anger so much as dissatisfaction, like someone critiquing the decor of a hotel room that hadn't lived up to its star rating. Daniel registered her presence without shifting, but behind his composed demeanor, something flared. An instinct, a ripple in the air that told him her presence at row 14 wasn't incidental. Then she spoke. Excuse me, she said sharply, her voice floating above the hum of conversation and overhead bins snapping shut. I need to switch seats with your daughter. Lena blinked. The words hadn't landed at first. She looked up from her book and then sideways at her father. Daniel, calm but direct, looked up at Veronica. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said evenly. These are the seats we booked, intentionally. Veronica's lips tightened. Yes, I understand that, but I have a medical condition. I suffer from claustrophobia, and window seats help with my anxiety. I'm sure your daughter can manage for one flight. Daniel's jaw tensed slightly. She also has a condition, motion sickness. She needs the window to avoid vomiting during takeoff. The woman's eyes flicked to Lena, then back to Daniel. There was a pause, and then came the shift, the moment the conversation slid from inconvenient to insidious. I'm sure she'll be just fine, Veronica replied with a sugar-coated edge. Children are resilient, and well, some of us have real health needs. Daniel exhaled through his nose slowly. He recognized the tone. It was the kind of tone that dismissed discomfort as dramatics when it came from the wrong person, in the wrong skin. Still, he kept his voice level. She's not moving. A few heads had turned now. A couple seated across the aisle watched with narrowed eyes. A man in a suit peered up from his tablet, but no one said anything yet. Veronica looked down at Lena again. Young lady, wouldn't you like to be helpful? To let someone in need have your seat? I'm sure your father has taught you how to be considerate. The implication wasn't just condescending. It was weaponized etiquette, the kind used by those who believed social niceties were tools for control. Lena, caught between her father's steady silence and the woman's false politeness, answered as best she could. I'm sorry, ma'am. I do get sick without a window. Veronica's smile disappeared. What a selfish response, she said coldly. Unbelievable. The entitlement in children these days? At that, the man across the aisle lowered his tablet completely. Daniel turned his head slowly toward Veronica. His voice, when it came, was low, controlled, but unmistakably firm. You've said enough. The words hung in the air, like a line drawn in the sand. Veronica's eyes narrowed. I don't know who you think you are, talking to me like that. I'm Lena's father, Daniel replied, and I'm telling you to stop harassing her. The quiet around them became heavy. Flight attendant Maya Green approached, her crisp uniform barely rustling as she stepped in. Is there a problem here? She asked politely, eyes darting between Veronica and the Brooks family. This man is refusing to switch his daughter's seat with me, Veronica huffed. I have a medical need. I'm claustrophobic. This is discrimination. No, ma'am, Maya replied without blinking. Discrimination would be forcing a child with motion sickness to accommodate an adult who refuses her assigned seat. Veronica's eyes widened, not from surprise but from affront. I'm a donor to your airline, she snapped. I sit on the advisory board of your outreach foundation. Do you know who I am? Maya didn't flinch. I know you're standing in the wrong section of the plane and making other passengers uncomfortable. Veronica turned her gaze back toward Daniel and then to Lena, her eyes cold. I'm just asking for decency, she said quietly. But it was venom, not vulnerability, that crept into her tone. Some of us don't expect everything handed to us. And there it was. The invisible hand of implication, made suddenly visible. Daniel's stare didn't move. Return to your seat. For a moment, Veronica stood motionless. Then Maya stepped closer. If you refuse to comply, she said gently but with the full authority of federal aviation law behind her, we will be required to delay this flight, and that will be noted in the report. The threat didn't need to be loud to be final. Veronica hesitated, then turned with a jerk of her shoulders and stormed up the aisle toward first class. Silence lingered for several seconds after her departure. Lena had gone still. Daniel gently reached for her hand, enclosing it in his. You okay? She nodded faintly, but her voice when she spoke was small. Why did she say I should be in the back? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he said softly, sometimes people think where you sit is who you are. But they're wrong. Outside the window, the tarmac began to blur as the plane taxied forward. Inside, Lena stared quietly ahead, no longer reading, and Daniel Brooks, father, protector, federal agent, sat with his heart burning, knowing this was far from over. The plane rumbled gently as it gained speed on the runway, wheels humming against the tarmac like the prelude to a symphony no one quite knew the tune to. Lena leaned into the window slightly, eyes wide, her small hand still tucked beneath her father's. She had stopped reading. Her book lay open on her tray table, its dog-eared page fluttering slightly in the cabin's subtle vibration. Daniel Brooks said nothing, not yet. He watched the runway stretch endlessly into the horizon and felt, more than heard, the unspoken weight settle over his daughter's shoulders. This trip was supposed to be light, a reunion, a reset. Instead, they had barely left the ground, and already something had cracked, not because of turbulence, but because of cruelty. As the aircraft lifted into the warm Georgia sky, Lena's stomach did a small somersault. Daniel felt her flinch slightly, but she did not complain. She never did. She had inherited that stubborn restraint from her father, and perhaps from her late mother too, a quiet endurance masked as politeness. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign turned off and a murmur of movement returned to the cabin. Overhead, bins creaked open, seat backs adjusted, and soft beeps from devices reconnected passengers to their digital distractions. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He had dealt with worse aggressors, criminals, and federal cases that dragged out for months. But nothing stirred him quite like seeing his child subjected to subtle violence masquerading as civility. Dad? Lena asked, her voice hesitant. That woman, she didn't care if I got sick, did she? Daniel opened his eyes, met hers. No, honey, she didn't. Lena frowned. But why would someone just decide they're more important? He turned slightly in his seat, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Some people carry around a kind of emptiness, Lena. They fill it with control, with status. It makes them believe they matter more. But it's not true. It never has been. You matter just as much. Seat 14A or anywhere. She nodded, but he saw it, the shadow of doubt creeping into her. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. The quiet tension hadn't gone unnoticed. Just then, the curtain between first class and the main cabin rustled. Daniel glanced up, and there she was, Veronica Aldridge. Again. She moved deliberately, heels muffled against the carpeted aisle, but every step betrayed her intent. The cabin hushed slightly, instinctively. Passengers shifted. Lena stiffened. Veronica didn't speak immediately. She stood beside their row, arms crossed, eyes glinting with the kind of restraint that came from being told no for the first time in years. Daniel met her gaze without moving. "You may think you've won something," she said quietly. Her voice aimed more at Daniel than Lena, but her eyes flicked between them. "But I have every right to request accommodations for my condition." "No one took your rights away," Daniel said, voice even. "You were assigned a seat. You refused it. That's not discrimination. That's entitlement." Veronica's jaw twitched. "You think just because you carry yourself like a federal agent that you get to dictate who deserves comfort?" Daniel's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I carry myself like a father." Her lips parted, ready to retort, but a new voice cut across the aisle. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" It was Maya Green again, the flight attendant. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something firmer, more resolute. "The seatbelt sign is off, but the captain has asked us to keep movement minimal. You're creating a disturbance." Veronica looked as if she might argue, but something in Maya's tone made her reconsider. With a breath, she turned back toward first class, but not before throwing one final parting remark over her shoulder. "I'm sure there are other seats where she'd be more comfortable anyway. Maybe further back, where she belongs." The words landed like stones in the quiet. A couple across the aisle gasped audibly. One man whispered, "Did she just say that?" A young woman 2 rows up turned, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Lena froze. Daniel didn't. He rose slowly. Not abruptly. No drama. Just a purpose. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulled out a thin leather wallet, and opened it with deliberate calm. Inside, a gold badge and federal identification. The air in the cabin thickened. "Ma'am," he said, no longer soft, no longer just a father, but now every inch the agent who had spent 2 decades protecting lives and enforcing law. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Brooks with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. What you just said to my daughter could be interpreted as targeted harassment, and under federal aviation law, your refusal to comply with crew instruction and your verbal misconduct are subject to immediate escalation." Veronica's face paled. The color drained so quickly it was as though the blood itself had been yanked from beneath her skin. Passengers watched in stunned silence. "I suggest," Daniel continued, his voice low and unwavering, "that you return to your seat immediately. Otherwise, I will ensure this flight is met on the ground by the appropriate authorities." For a moment, she looked like she might say something, but she didn't. She turned, and she walked slowly, rigidly, back toward first class. Maya exhaled quietly and gave Daniel a small, respectful nod. "Thank you, sir." Daniel returned to his seat, slowly folding the badge wallet and tucking it back into his coat. Lena looked at him, eyes big, heart racing, and something unspoken stirring behind her silence. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, sweetheart," he said. "We just reminded someone that rules don't bend for arrogance." Lena sat quietly for a moment before reaching out and taking her book again. But instead of reading, she whispered, "I'm glad you're my dad." Daniel looked out the window, the clouds billowing past like silent witnesses. He didn't smile. He just reached over, took her hand again, and said, "I'm glad you're my daughter." Silence in an airplane cabin is never truly silent. There's always the drone of engines, the subtle clink of ice in plastic cups, the muffled whispers of passengers adjusting to altitude. But after Agent Daniel Brooks revealed his badge, the silence aboard Flight 20275 became something else entirely. It was no longer background noise. It was loaded, reverent, electric. People weren't just watching now. They were remembering, processing, shifting. Maya Green had quietly returned to her post near the galley, though her eyes flicked toward row 14 every so often, an unspoken look of solidarity resting in her gaze. For the rest of the crew, the routine resumed. Beverage carts, seatbelt checks, softly spoken apologies for turbulence. But the emotional current that had sliced through the cabin left everyone subtly changed. Lena sat quietly, one hand resting on her book, but not turning the page. Her face was calm, but not peaceful. Something had been disrupted, not just her comfort, but the way she understood the world. Daniel leaned slightly toward her. Want to talk about it? She didn't answer at first, then softly. She didn't even look sorry. Daniel nodded slowly. Some people don't apologize because they don't think they did anything wrong. And others, he paused. Others know they're wrong, but they're too proud to admit it. Lena glanced down. So, which one is she? Daniel exhaled. Maybe both. From 2 rows behind them, someone cleared their throat gently. A woman, her voice soft but deliberate, spoke up. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said. I couldn't not say something. Daniel turned slightly in his seat, Lena glancing up as well. The woman stepped closer to their row and offered a small, respectful nod. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in slate blue scrubs beneath a light cardigan, and wore an ID badge clipped discreetly to her pocket. Dr. Natalie Wong, she introduced, pediatric cardiac surgeon at UCSF. I was at a conference in Atlanta. I happened to be sitting just a few rows back. Her tone was measured, but her eyes carried warmth, and something else. Empathy forged from experience. I saw what happened, she continued, and I just wanted to say, how you both handled it was extraordinary. Calm, dignified, especially you, young lady. Her eyes moved to Lena, softening. You stood your ground with grace. That's not easy at any age. Lena blinked, a bit stunned. Thank you, she murmured. Natalie smiled. You don't need to say anything back. I just felt it was important to speak up. Daniel extended his hand. Agent Daniel Brooks, and this is Lena. Natalie accepted the handshake. It's an honor, Agent Brooks. And Lena, if it's all right with you, I'd love to recommend a book next time you're in San Francisco. The California Academy of Sciences has a whole exhibit on the human heart. I think you'd love it. Lena's face lit up for the first time in an hour. I love that place. We're going there. Natalie grinned. Then maybe I'll see you there. I do some outreach talks for kids about anatomy, surgery, and, well, resilience. The three shared a quiet moment, the kind that didn't need elaboration. Then Natalie nodded once more and returned to her seat, leaving behind a sense of solidarity that lingered like warmth in the air. The plane continued its slow passage westward. Through the oval window, the cotton clouds gave way to golden sunlight spilling across the wing. Daniel turned toward Lena again, but she was already gazing out the window, pensive but no longer defeated. Back in first class, however, Veronica Aldridge sat rigidly in her seat, hands folded over her designer handbag like a dam barely holding back something volatile. Her cheeks still burned with the aftershocks of confrontation. But it wasn't regret that filled her. It was humiliation. And humiliation for someone like her was intolerable. She had built a life on being untouchable, on whispered admiration in charity boardrooms, on being the woman who always knew someone. But now seat 4C might as well have been a courtroom, and she'd lost. Can I get you something to drink, ma'am? Asked Maya, approaching with careful courtesy. Veronica didn't look up. Vodka tonic, double. Maya noted the order with professionalism and retreated. Seated next to her in 4B was an older man with a quiet presence and distinguished grace. He wore a charcoal vest over a crisp shirt, his hair silver and slicked back, his expression unreadable. For most of the flight, he had remained silent, until now. Rough start to the flight, he said casually, his voice bearing the trace of a Boston accent. Veronica looked up sharply, unsure if it was an opening or a judgment. Misunderstanding, she replied quickly. I have a medical condition. The man tilted his head, unconvinced but unbothered. Charles Emerson, he said, offering his hand. Retired federal judge. Veronica hesitated, then shook his hand out of habit. Veronica Aldridge. I gathered. His tone was cordial but pointed. You made quite an impression. She shifted in her seat. I asked for a different seat. That's not illegal. No, but neither is being decent, Judge Emerson said mildly. What struck me wasn't your request, it was your language. She bristled. I didn't say anything offensive. You told a young girl she might be better off in the back of the plane, he said plainly. That's not a seat request. That's a statement. Veronica's eyes narrowed. You're twisting it. No, he said gently. I'm clarifying it. As someone who spent decades listening to people defend their words, I can assure you, intent matters. But so does effect. And I watched the effect of your words ripple through that cabin. Veronica turned toward the window, saying nothing. Her vodka tonic arrived, and she took a long sip. But Judge Emerson's words lingered, like smoke that refused to clear. Back in row 14, Lena had finally turned the page in her book. Her voice, soft but curious, reached Daniel's ear. Dad, do you think she'll get in trouble? Daniel paused. Not in the way you're thinking. But maybe this flight will stay with her. Lena nodded thoughtfully, then said, I hope she remembers my face. Daniel looked at her, surprised. I hope, Lena said quietly, that next time she sees someone like me, she thinks twice. Daniel smiled, this time without hesitation. She will. The sky beyond the cabin windows was streaked with streaks of amber and soft blue sunlight scattering across the stratosphere like a fragile promise. But inside Flight 275, the calm that had momentarily returned was once again on the verge of rupture. It began with a subtle jolt. Nothing dramatic, no alarms, just the kind of turbulence that made cups tremble and seatbelt signs blink back on with a familiar chime. Lena instinctively reached for the armrest. Daniel was already ahead of her, steadying her hand. It's just the air shifting, he said softly. Perfectly normal. But even normal could become unsettling when the human heart had already been shaken. Lena nodded, eyes flicking to the seatbelt light, then back to the aisle. From the front of the cabin, a voice sounded through the intercom. Captain Rivera, calm and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor mechanical issue. Out of an abundance of caution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. Please remain seated with your belts fastened until further notice. A ripple of unease passed through the plane. It wasn't panic, not yet, but the silence that followed spoke of the collective question hanging in the air. Is this serious? Daniel's training kicked in almost immediately. His eyes swept the cabin, not with fear, but with purpose. He knew the signs of a genuine crisis. This wasn't one of them. No oxygen masks, no smoke, no sudden descent. But it was still an opportunity to do what he always did. Reassure. He leaned toward Lena. Think of it like the check engine light in the car. They're just being careful. Lena managed a faint smile. We're not crashing? No, he said gently. We're just pausing, like turning the car around for a tune-up. That settled her shoulders slightly, though the unease lingered in her eyes. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, some murmuring prayers, others staring straight ahead, knuckles white against armrests. And somewhere in that anxious hush, Veronica Aldridge sat fuming. Not because of fear, but because the narrative had shifted again, and not in her favor. First the window seat, then the badge. Now this. In her mind, the flight had unraveled into an elaborate humiliation, as though the universe itself had conspired to bruise her pride. She gripped her leather bag tightly, willing herself invisible among the first-class passengers who now refused to make eye contact with her. Next to her, Judge Charles Emerson watched her quietly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was weight enough. After the landing announcement, the tension simmered for 20 minutes until the wheels kissed the Denver runway. The passengers clapped, a rare expression of collective relief. The plane taxied to a remote gate where maintenance crews would assess the issue. Then came the next announcement. A 3-hour delay. Captain Rivera's voice was steady but apologetic. You're welcome to deplane and wait in the terminal during the inspection. We'll make updates as soon as we have them. The aisle became a river of motion. People stood, stretched, and sighed. Some muttered frustrations. Others, like Daniel, simply moved with quiet efficiency. Let's get some air, he told Lena. Maybe some food. She nodded eagerly. Can we find something sweet? Daniel smiled. You read my mind. They gathered their carry-ons and joined the stream of passengers entering the terminal. The Denver airport was bright and humming with activity. Families wheeled luggage. Gate agents tapped on screens. Security guards stood sentinel with practiced ease. Amidst this flow of strangers, Lena held close to her father's side as they walked toward a nearby restaurant boasting authentic Colorado cuisine. The sign outside advertised green chili, elk burgers, and fresh sourdough. Lena wrinkled her nose playfully. "I don't think I'm ready for elk," she teased. Daniel chuckled. "Let's start with something milder." They found a booth near the window, ordered a pair of sodas and a shareable plate of chili and cornbread. For a moment, they could almost forget the altitude, the confrontation, the badge. Almost. Because a few minutes later, the bell above the restaurant door jingled, and in walked Dr. Natalie Wong, looking momentarily adrift in the crowd. Her gaze scanned the room until it landed on the familiar faces at the booth. "Mind if I join you?" she asked with a warm smile. Daniel gestured to the empty seat across from Lena. "We'd be honored." Natalie slid into the booth, setting down her carry-on with a tired sigh. "Dining alone in airports always makes me feel like I've taken a wrong turn in life," she joked. Lena giggled. "Then you turned the right way this time." Conversation came easily between them, like threads falling into a natural braid. Natalie spoke about her surgical conference. Daniel shared sanitized stories from the bureau, and Lena chimed in with questions about marine biology, her latest fascination. Then came the moment that reminded them of the day's shadows. Lena paused mid-bite, her gaze shifting across the restaurant. "Dad, that lady from the plane. She's here." Daniel turned. Sure enough, Veronica had entered the same restaurant, scanning for an empty table. She looked exhausted, not physically but emotionally. Her movements were slower, her gaze more uncertain, and she was alone. Natalie noticed too, her smile fading. "Is that her?" Daniel nodded. Lena said nothing. Instead, she watched as Veronica chose a table in the far corner, deliberately placing herself as far from them as possible. "I don't think she's going to say sorry," Lena murmured. Daniel replied without turning. "That's okay. You don't need her words to know your worth." But just then, a familiar voice approached. "Pardon the interruption," said Judge Charles Emerson, standing beside their table. Daniel rose slightly. "Judge Emerson." The older man nodded. "I wanted to extend my apologies to your daughter. What she endured earlier was unacceptable. And I also have something else to share." Daniel tilted his head. "I spoke with Ms. Aldridge," Charles said, voice lowered. "She may not have used the word sorry, but she did express that perhaps she overreacted." Natalie arched an eyebrow. "That's the sanitized version?" The judge offered a dry smile. "I took the liberty of interpreting." Lena looked at him, unsure whether to smile or shrink, but instead she simply said, "Thank you." It wasn't to the judge. It wasn't even for Veronica. It was for herself, for standing up, for holding steady, for surviving the storm. And Daniel. He looked at her with something deeper than pride. It was faith in her, in the world, in the fact that even clouds, no matter how dark, eventually pass. Back aboard Flight 2275, the energy had shifted again, not with chaos, but with clarity. The unexpected landing in Denver had acted like a filter. It sifted through the tension in the air, revealing the layers beneath. Discomfort, reflection, quiet transformation. Some passengers returned to their seats carrying fast food and coffee. Others brought back something heavier, unspoken thoughts about what they had witnessed in row 14. Daniel and Lena reboarded last, accompanied by Dr. Natalie Wong and the ever-dignified Judge Charles Emerson. The flight attendants greeted them with subtle nods of familiarity. Maya Green, standing near the front galley, caught Daniel's eye and offered a small, knowing smile. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. "We're doing fine," Daniel replied. But Maya leaned in just slightly and said in a softer voice, "You should know, before we took off again, the captain had a word with Ms. Aldridge. Firm, private, very clear." Daniel didn't need the details. He understood the implication. Veronica Aldridge had been warned. He gave a quiet nod. "Thank you." Back in row 14, Lena nestled into her window seat once more. this time clutching a small cup of mint chocolate chip ice cream, courtesy of a snack kiosk in the terminal and a soft bribe from her father. She dipped her spoon into the melting scoop, but her eyes remained distant, fixed on something beyond the clouds. Daniel watched her. It wasn't that she was scared anymore. It was deeper than fear. Lena was processing something no child should have to absorb so young. The realization that dignity, even when defended, could still be bruised. "She said I didn't belong in that seat," Lena whispered suddenly, and then she sat up there like nothing happened. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked out his window, the sky a soft canvas of gold and gray. "She's not the only one who thinks that way," Lena continued. "Right?" Daniel turned. The pain in her voice was not loud. That's what made it echo. "No," he said quietly. "She's not." Lena's lips pressed together. "Then why even fight it?" His voice came slower now, deeper. "Because we're not fighting her. We're fighting the silence she represents." Lena blinked. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned in slightly, so only she could hear. "People like her, they rely on the idea that no one will push back, that others will be too polite, too tired, too quiet. But the second someone says, 'No more,' even just once, it disrupts everything." He touched her shoulder gently. "You did that today. You disrupted the silence." Lena nodded, but her eyes shimmered. "It still hurt." Daniel pulled her into a gentle side hug. "Of course it did. Brave doesn't mean unbreakable." For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engines filled the space between them, and for a while that was enough. Further up in first class, Veronica Aldridge sat motionless, as though bound not by seatbelt, but by shame. The conversation with the captain had not been public, but its sting had been precise. "You will not speak to passengers in a way that violates their dignity," Captain Rivera had told her. "Any further incident, and you will be restrained and met by law enforcement at landing. Is that understood?" Veronica had nodded. She hadn't spoken a word since. Now, as she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes wandered back, almost involuntarily, toward the curtain separating the cabins. She could not see Lena, but in her mind the girl's quiet refusal, her composed defiance, replayed again and again. It haunted her more than the badge had, not because Lena had been rude, but because she hadn't. It was easier to dismiss people when they shouted, when they met aggression with fire. But Lena, she had simply said no, with trembling grace and wide eyes that refused to shrink. And that had made Veronica feel small. For the first time in years, the woman who built her life on deference and decorum realized she had become the very thing she used to judge in others: bitter, petty, and scared of losing control. As she sipped water, vodka no longer appealing, her thoughts swirled in silence. A few rows behind her, Judge Emerson leaned toward the aisle and observed her quietly. He had seen many expressions in his courtroom over 3 decades: rage, denial, contempt. But shame? Real shame. That one was rare and fragile. Back in the main cabin, the world had righted itself in small ways. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Beverage carts rolled by again. A toddler laughed 2 rows up. For the first time since the flight began, it felt like a normal journey. And yet it wasn't. Because one row, one exchange, one badge, one child's voice had changed the way people breathed in that space. Across the aisle from Daniel and Lena sat James Reyes, a journalism professor who had been taking notes since boarding. He hadn't yet spoken to Daniel, not directly, but now he leaned over slightly. "Mr. Brooks," he said in a low voice, "I hope I'm not intruding." Daniel looked up. "Not at all." James extended his hand. "James Reyes. I teach journalism at Berkeley. I've covered social movements, civil rights, stories like this, for a long time." Daniel's brow lifted slightly. "Stories like what?" "Like this one," James replied, nodding toward Lena. "Like what happens when ordinary people confront quiet injustice and don't back down." Daniel hesitated. "We're not looking for attention." "I understand," James said, "but I'm not writing a headline. I'm documenting a shift." He paused and then added, "This flight, this moment, it's not about scandal. It's about courage and ripple effects. Daniel looked at Lena, who had resumed eating her ice cream, listening without interrupting. "I'll think about it," Daniel said. James nodded, respecting the boundary. But Lena surprised them both. "You should write it," she said, not looking up, "so people know what kindness looks like, even when it's scared." Daniel turned to her, startled, but deeply moved. James smiled softly. "That's the best closing line I've ever heard." And just like that, the silence in the cabin took on a new tone, not heavy with judgment or fear, but filled with quiet admiration. For a girl with trembling hands and a steady voice, for a father who stood his ground without raising his voice, for the quiet witnesses who were no longer willing to remain silent. At 36,000 feet, with clouds drifting past like thoughts unspoken, Flight 2275 pressed forward, toward San Francisco and perhaps toward something else entirely. Somewhere over Colorado, the late afternoon sunlight began to soften, brushing the cabin walls with hues of rose gold and amber. The hum of the engines was steady, a calming metronome in the aftermath of so much unseen turbulence. But inside, something continued to build. Veronica Aldridge, for the first time in years, felt herself trapped not by metal or altitude, but by memory. Her entire life had been calibrated for control, her tone, her appearance, her expectations. She had never been the kind of woman who apologized because to apologize meant to relinquish power. And power had been her armor, shiny, brittle, and too thin for what this flight had laid bare. She sipped her water slowly, eyes unfocused. She could still hear the girl's voice. "I'm sorry you're uncomfortable, ma'am, but I do get sick without a window seat." Not defiant, not cruel, just true. That voice, so calm and earnest, had unraveled Veronica in ways she hadn't expected. Not because it had threatened her, but because it had revealed her. And when Daniel Brooks had raised his badge with the steady authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard, it wasn't just the law she'd come face to face with. It was dignity. It had looked her in the eye, and she had looked away. Now as the sun shifted westward and the steward lights dimmed to prepare for evening descent, Judge Charles Emerson leaned in slightly from the adjacent seat. "She's just a child," he said softly, "and she will remember this." Veronica flinched. "I know." The judge waited, then added, "The question is, what will she remember about you?" Veronica stared forward. A long silence passed between them. Then she whispered, "I don't know how to say sorry to someone I tried to erase." Emerson didn't offer comfort. He simply replied, "Then say it exactly like that." Further back, Lena Brooks had finished her ice cream. She now held her sketch pad on her lap, a soft pencil in hand, shading the outline of a whale's heart, something she'd once seen in a documentary and couldn't forget. Her brows furrowed in concentration. Next to her, Daniel watched with quiet pride. Every so often, he glanced across the aisle toward James Reyes, the professor who now scribbled in a worn leather notebook. A headline wasn't coming, but a record was. A legacy. And then the air shifted again. Not with turbulence this time, but with motion. Footsteps. Measured. Uneasy. Veronica Aldridge emerged from behind the curtain of first class like a reluctant actor stepping onto a stage she no longer controlled. Passengers noticed. Murmurs rose. Eyes followed her down the aisle. Not out of curiosity now, but anticipation. What would she do? She stopped at row 14. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the seat back in front of her to steady herself. Her voice, when it came, was thin but audible. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel looked up slowly. Lena froze beside him. Veronica's eyes scanned the ceiling briefly, as if searching for some higher courage. Then she said haltingly, "I wanted to apologize for what I said earlier, for how I spoke to your daughter. It was unacceptable." She looked at Lena now. "For the first time, I truly looked. I assumed things. I used harmful language. I let my discomfort become cruelty. That's not who I want to be." The cabin had gone still. Lena blinked. It was one thing to hear an apology. It was another to feel it. "I'm sorry," Veronica added, her voice trembling. Lena's lips parted. A dozen words floated in her mind. Hurt, anger, confusion. But she chose none of them. Instead, she said what only a child with grace beyond her years could. "Thank you for saying sorry." The cabin exhaled as if it had been holding its breath. Veronica nodded, eyes glassy, and turned to go. But Judge Emerson, who had quietly followed behind her, gently placed a hand on her arm. "She's also agreed," he said, speaking to Daniel, "to donate to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, as a gesture not just of remorse, but of learning." Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised but measured. Veronica didn't speak again. She simply nodded once more, then returned to her seat with a weight that no longer came from pride, but from reckoning. Lena watched her go, and for the first time since they left Atlanta, her shoulders relaxed. The rest of the flight unfolded like a second act after the conflict had cleared. A softer, more reflective tempo. Passengers leaned back. Some smiled quietly. Others looked out the window with a renewed sense of awareness, not just of the landscape, but of the people around them. Maya Green passed through the aisle once more, checking on passengers. She stopped at row 14, crouched slightly beside Lena, and whispered, "You were incredible." Lena beamed. Daniel, with a quiet smile, simply said, "She gets that from her mom." As the flight began its final descent into San Francisco, the bay appeared like a sheet of light beneath the wing, dotted with boats, bridges, and the city that waited like a promise on the horizon. Lena looked out, face bathed in sunlight. "Dad?" she asked. "Do you think she meant it? The apology?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then, "I think she meant enough of it to try. And sometimes, that's where change begins." Lena nodded. "I think I'd like to go to that museum someday." Daniel's eyes glinted. "I think your name deserves to be in one." The wheels of Flight 22275 touched down on the runway at San Francisco International Airport with a soft, satisfying thud. The cabin stirred, first with the exhale of landing, then with the usual rustling of seatbelts, stretching legs and sighs of relief. But beneath that routine, something more subtle stirred too, a shift in energy, in understanding. Something had changed in the hearts of those who had borne witness to what unfolded at 36,000 feet. In row 14, Lena Brooks leaned forward, her eyes glued to the window. The skyline of San Francisco stood in the distance, veiled in fog and gold-tinted sun. "There's Grandma Edith's neighborhood," she whispered, pressing a fingertip to the glass as though to touch the city she loved. Daniel, sitting beside her, smiled gently. "Still looks like home?" Lena nodded. "It always does." Behind them, passengers began collecting their things, but no one rushed. It was as though people knew that exiting this flight too quickly would mean leaving behind something that needed a little more time to settle. In first class, Veronica Aldridge remained seated, still and upright. The apology she delivered an hour ago hovered in her mind, not because it had been grand or graceful, but because it had been terrifying. Saying "I'm sorry" had never been harder. Not in the boardroom, not at the club, not even in the courtroom she'd once financed renovations for. And yet, in that narrow aisle before a 12-year-old girl, it had felt like her soul had been laid bare. Next to her, Judge Charles Emerson closed his leather-bound notebook and said quietly, "You stepped toward something hard today." Veronica didn't answer right away. She only replied, "I don't know if it made a difference." The judge offered a small, reflective smile. "Maybe not yet, but it might echo." Back in the terminal, the warm hum of arrival filled the air. Rolling suitcases, PA announcements, travelers navigating tight connections or reuniting with loved ones. Standing in the middle of it all was Edith Brooks, tall and silver-haired, dressed in a tailored blazer and silk scarf. Even at 75, she exuded presence, the kind of woman who had once stood before the Supreme Court and had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. When she spotted Daniel and Lena walking toward her, she called out in a voice that cut through the noise, "There they are!" Lena ran first, flinging herself into her grandmother's arms with the kind of trust that time and truth had forged. Daniel followed behind, wheeling their bags, his arms outstretched. Edith held her son tightly for a moment before pulling back to study his face. "You look like you've been through something." Daniel laughed lightly. "You don't know the half of it." Lena, breathless and radiant, began talking all at once. "Grandma, we had a crazy flight. A woman tried to take my seat. She said I didn't belong there, but Daddy stood up, and then this doctor helped us, and then the judge made her apologize. It was like a movie. Edith glanced at Daniel, her eyes narrowing. She said what? Daniel nodded slowly. It was ugly, but it didn't end that way. Edith took Lena's hand, gave it a soft squeeze. You handled it, didn't you? Lena hesitated. It hurt, but I didn't cry, and I didn't move. The look Edith gave her was nothing short of pride. Just like your mother, she murmured. For a moment, grief passed gently between them. The memory of Sophia Brooks, wife, mother, advocate, still lived in their bones, their breath, their choices, and in Lena. Later that evening, they returned to Edith's home in the Sunset District, a lovingly restored Victorian house with stained glass windows and the lingering scent of peach cobbler in the kitchen. The kind of home where every creak of the floorboard told a story. As the sun dipped beneath the Pacific, Daniel, Lena, and Edith sat at the dining table, the remnants of dinner scattered before them. Laughter had returned, fuller now, earned. Then a gentle knock came at the door. Edith raised an eyebrow. Expecting someone? Daniel stood cautiously. Not that I know of. He opened the door to find Dr. Natalie Wong holding a small gift bag and wearing the same quiet smile she had on the plane. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I was staying nearby for the conference. I thought I'd drop this off. Daniel stepped aside warmly. You're always welcome. Natalie stepped into the warmth of the house, greeting Lena with a hug and handing her the gift, a signed field guide to marine biology from the Academy of Sciences. I figured you might want to start your next project early. Lena beamed. I was just sketching a whale heart, Edith chuckled. I like her already. They sat together for a while, joined soon after by another unexpected visitor. James Reyes, the journalism professor, who had taken a leap and called Daniel after disembarking. He entered the house with a notepad in hand and reverence in his eyes. I wanted to say thank you, not just for the moment, but for the lesson. What happened on that plane? It's the kind of story that lasts. Edith tilted her head. Then tell it well. He nodded. I intend to. As night deepened, the small group gathered in the living room. No drama, no speeches, just conversation, soft and real. Daniel asked Natalie about her upcoming surgeries. Lena asked James about interviewing oceanographers. Edith poured warm cider, and in a quiet moment, they all looked toward the window where the city's lights blinked through a soft veil of fog. I never expected this trip to be like this, Lena said aloud. Daniel turned to her. No one ever does, but sometimes the most unexpected journeys to become the ones that change you, Edith finished. Outside, the fog rolled in. Inside, they stayed grounded by truth, by connection, and by the quiet beginnings of legacy. The next morning, San Francisco was bathed in soft light, the kind of quiet brilliance that made the city seem both ancient and new. Fog clung to the tops of buildings like secrets not yet spoken, and below, in the warm kitchen of the Brooks home, the scent of cinnamon and toasted sourdough filled the air. Lena sat at the window, a steaming mug of cocoa between her palms. Her sketchpad rested beside her, open to a half-finished drawing of the plane, the engines, the wing, the faint outlines of seats drawn with quiet precision. You gonna finish that? Edith asked, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and avocado toast across the table. Maybe later, Lena replied, her voice softer than usual. Daniel, dressed in jeans and a navy t-shirt, leaned against the counter, watching his daughter. Still thinking about the flight? Lena nodded. Kind of. Edith joined them, settling into the seat across from Lena. What part's still in your head, sweetheart? Lena hesitated. It's not just what she said, it's how people reacted after. Like, some people looked away, and others watched, but didn't say anything. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Sometimes silence is fear. Sometimes it's uncertainty. But the most dangerous silence is the one that convinces us to doubt ourselves. Lena looked up at him. But what if I had stayed silent? Edith answered before Daniel could. Then she would have won. Not because she was right, but because no one reminded her she was wrong. Lena looked down at her sketchpad. Then slowly, intentionally, she turned the page and began to draw again. Later that afternoon, the Brooks family was invited to a panel discussion at the University of California, San Francisco, where Dr. Natalie Wong was a guest speaker. The event, originally organized around pediatric health equity, had quietly shifted focus after the story of the confrontation on Flight 2275 began circulating among faculty. Natalie had reached out to Daniel that morning. "You don't have to speak," she said, "but I think it would mean something if you were in the room." Now seated in the front row of a modest campus auditorium, Daniel watched as Natalie stepped up to the podium. Behind her, a slide read, "Quiet courage, dignity, bias, and the spaces between." Natalie began. "I'm a surgeon. I operate on tiny hearts. I understand systems, anatomy, medicine, recovery, but there's a system we don't always see. It isn't physical. It's social, cultural, and sometimes it's just a row on a plane." The audience sat silently, captivated. "I want to tell you about a girl named Lena." Natalie continued, voice steady. 12 years old. A passenger on a plane. She was told in front of dozens of people that she didn't belong where she was sitting, that her place was further back. She wasn't loud. She wasn't rude. She just said no. Daniel reached over and squeezed Lena's hand. She looked up at him, eyes wide. Natalie's voice softened. That moment mattered. Not just because it exposed a prejudice, but because it revealed something even more powerful. Grace, from a child who never forgot who she was, even when someone tried to erase her. The room fell still, the weight of those words hanging in the air like stained glass, refracting truth. After the panel, dozens of students and faculty approached the Brooks family, some with tears, others with questions. James Reyes, notebook in hand, lingered nearby, observing as if watching the ripple of one moment become something larger. He approached Daniel later, just outside the glass doors of the building, the sky behind them now turning orange with dusk. "I wanted to let you know," he said, "I've submitted a draft, a long-form piece, not for a headline, for a journal that specializes in civic impact." Daniel gave him a measured look. "You mentioned that, but you didn't ask for permission." James nodded, acknowledging the critique. "I didn't, because I wasn't writing about you. I was writing around you, around what you all showed the rest of us." He handed Daniel a copy of the manuscript. Title, Seat 14A, A Story of Quiet Resistance at 36,000 Feet. Daniel flipped through the pages. Quotes, analysis, context. But most importantly, humanity. "You captured her voice," Daniel said quietly. James shrugged. "I didn't." "She did." That evening, back at Edith's home, the Brooks family gathered on the porch as the city's lights began to twinkle beneath the fog. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to, but the silence between them was different now. Not hollow, but whole. Lena sat curled up beside her grandmother, watching the lights. "Grandma." "Yes, baby." "Do you think she'll remember me?" Edith paused, her voice low and full of quiet certainty. "I think she'll remember the girl who made her look in the mirror for the first time in a long time." Daniel stepped outside, phone in hand. "Captain Rivera just called." Lena sat up. "Really?" "He wanted to let us know that a new training module is being proposed at the airline. Mandatory training on unconscious bias and passenger dignity. He's calling it the Brooks Protocol." Lena blinked. "Us?" Daniel smiled. "You." Far across the city, in a penthouse apartment dimly lit by the last traces of day, Veronica Aldridge sat alone. She'd seen the article, watched the speech, and for once she hadn't scoffed. She had listened. And in that silence she began, just barely, to understand that what she had done wasn't simply about a seat, or even a child. It was about a worldview that needed unraveling, piece by piece, and she had met the first tug on that thread at 36,000 feet. 3 weeks after Flight 2275 touched down in San Francisco, it had become something far more than just a cross-country flight. It had become a conversation. Among airline staff, it was referenced in hushed but reverent tones. In training rooms, it was studied, an unplanned case study on bias, dignity, and the power of one voice. In schools and homes, it was quietly passed around as a story worth remembering. And then one morning, beneath a clear sky, In the bright glass dome of Skyspan Airlines headquarters, a gathering took place. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a corporate apology tour. It was a ceremony, a moment to name something that had risen, unexpected, quiet, and unshakable from that flight. Lena Brooks, now dressed in a powder blue dress and simple flats, stood with her father at the front of a wide auditorium. Industry leaders, airline executives, flight crews, passengers, professors, and students filled the seats. Some knew the full story. Some had only heard fragments. All were here for the same reason: to listen, to witness. Beside Lena, Daniel Brooks stood tall, not as a federal agent, not as a speaker, but as a father. His suit was simple. His presence was not. A senior executive from Skyspan approached the microphone. Today, we officially introduce a new internal program at Skyspan, a mandatory initiative on unconscious bias and passenger dignity. It was inspired not by a headline, but by a moment. And that moment was shaped by the quiet strength of a 12-year-old girl who reminded us what grace and courage look like, even when seated in row 14A. He turned toward Lena and Daniel. We're proud to name it the Brooks Standard. The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Lena didn't flinch or blush. She looked up at her father, and the two exchanged a glance. It didn't say we made history. It said we did what was right. Daniel leaned down and whispered, "You made this happen." Lena smiled, small and true. We made it happen. That evening, a cream-colored envelope arrived in their mailbox. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of thick paper, handwritten in elegant cursive. Lena read it aloud. Dear Lena, there are things in life that take minutes to say and years to mean. My apology for the plain being's late and too small. You didn't owe me grace, but you gave it anyway. Thank you for holding your seat and your dignity. I have a lot to unlearn, but I've started. Sincerely, V. Daniel placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder after she finished. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because some apologies don't erase wounds. But they begin something else: accountability. That weekend, Lena and her family joined Dr. Natalie Wong at a small waterfront gathering she hosted monthly for colleagues and friends in medicine and education. Over shared meals and warm laughter, Lena found herself seated next to a marine biologist from Sausalito, talking about dolphin echolocation and the complexities of whale communication. At one point, Lena leaned toward her father and said, I think I want to be a scientist and a writer. Daniel chuckled. Ambitious. She grinned. Maybe a science reporter. I want to tell stories that help people see the world better. Natalie, overhearing this, raised her glass. To stories, and to the people brave enough to tell them. A few days later, at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, a new photo was added to the Everyday Courage exhibit. It wasn't a dramatic image. It was quiet. Lena, seated in 14A, was reading a paperback novel by the window. Natural light poured across her face. She looked calm, unapologetically present. Below the photo, a small plaque read, Some seats aren't just numbers, they're declarations. Lena Brooks, aged 12. And somewhere else, on a different plane, a young flight attendant was tested. An entitled passenger made a subtle, sneering remark about a black couple boarding in first class. The flight attendant didn't flinch. She stood firm and said, Sir, our policy is clear. Every passenger on this flight has earned their place, and everyone here deserves to fly with dignity. The cabin went silent. No badge was shown, no speech was made. Just a quiet standard, now named and known. Back in San Francisco, the Brooks household settled into a new rhythm. One evening after dinner, Lena opened her laptop to find a new email notification. Subject line, Seat 14A, a case study in quiet resistance. The sender, James Reyes. Inside was a link to his newly published article in a national journal on ethics and civic leadership. It had already been shared thousands of times. Professors were teaching it, flight academies were adopting it, and classrooms were debating it. Lena clicked on the link and scrolled down. In the introduction, James had written, This is not a story of outrage. It's a story of restraint, of grace, of a child who refused to be moved, not just from her seat, but from her sense of worth. Daniel stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. She's not going to forget you, he said. Who? Lena asked. The woman, he said. Veronica, or anyone else like her. Lena leaned back in her chair and looked out the window. Good, she said. That night, in a penthouse apartment far from the warmth of the Brooks home, Veronica Aldridge sat alone with the lights off. She had read the article. Twice. She had seen the speech. She had seen the exhibit photo. And now at last she had seen herself. Not as a victim of embarrassment, but as the architect of her unraveling. She folded the newspaper on her lap and whispered, I remember you, Lena. And for the first time, she said it with something that sounded like hope. On the following flight to New York, Daniel and Lena flew again. This time, no one questioned their seats. No one challenged their presence. A young flight attendant stopped by their row before takeoff. I just wanted to say thank you, she whispered. Because of your story, we've been retrained. And because of her, she looked at Lena. I stood up to someone last week. I remembered the photo, the quote. Lena smiled, a little stunned. You remembered me? The flight attendant nodded. We all did. Flight 2275 wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a landmark in the sky. A reminder that resistance doesn't have to roar. It can sit still. That justice doesn't always arrive in sirens. It can arrive in silence.